I'm Hussein Yilmaz. I'm the research director of Abu Suleiman Center for Global Islamic Studies, and our interim director, Muriam is also with us. Muriam Haleh Davis is an assistant professor at University of California, Santa Cruz, and she's a scholar of race, development, and the social sciences in North Africa. Her recent book, Markets of Civilization, Islam and Racial Capitalism in Algeria, was published by Duke University Press in September 2022. She has also co-edited North Africa and the Making of Europe, Governance, Institutions, and Culture, which was published by Bloomsbury Press in 2018. She has published extensively in academic journals, as well as opinion pieces in leading media outlets. So we are very excited to have her, our featured speaker today. The title of her talk is Discussion of Markets of Civilization, Islam and Racial Capitalism Ideology. The talk will be recorded for your information, and at the end of the talk, we are hoping to have enough time for question and answer session. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome and present Muriam. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. It's really delightful to be here and be able to talk to colleagues who are interested in global Islamic studies. So I'm really excited to share my work. I'm going to be presenting on the book. I obviously won't get through everything, but just to give you an idea of what the book is trying to accomplish and some of the main questions I was asking. We are having another round of atmospheric rivers, a term I just learned this year out here in California. So I'm going to hope that my internet bears with me. So I'll open with the same anecdote that the book opens with, which is that which is really, I think, at the heart of the book and gives an idea of the kinds of questions that come out of it. On the 1st of April, 1947, the Swiss diplomat William Rapard gave the opening lecture at the first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Conference. And this is a conference that had been organized by Frederick Hayek and has been considered to be the first articulation of a quote unquote neoliberal thought collective by some scholars. And so William Rapard himself is a fascinating figure in that he had spent 18 years as the director of the mandate section at the League of Nations. And so he's part of this body that's responsible for administering the colonies that were carved out of the Ottoman and German empires after World War I. And so Rapard is giving this talk, among colleagues who are interested in the history of economic ideas and what to do with the economy after World War II. And he mused on the alleged universality of Adam Smith's writings. And Adam Smith had posited that, quote, the average man always and everywhere sought to obtain the maximum amount of material satisfaction at a minimum cost of effort, unquote. And so this is Rapard riffing off of Adam Smith. And so Rapard wondered about this ideal of the rational wealth maximizing subject. And basically he wondered, would this subject have would the subject have acted similarly if he had been born elsewhere? And indeed, this question of a wealth maximizing rational subject is at the center of a number of debates around what has been called Homo economicus. But Rapard was very troubled by the assumption that this model of humanity was relevant everywhere. And here he starts to talk about his time in Algeria. So here we finally get to Algeria after a bit of a buildup. He recounted his time in Algeria during the landing of the Allied forces in November 1942. And he said that he had been, quote, impressed by the sight of the Arabs seated on the curb of the sidewalks, who seemed quite indifferent to what was going on and were absolutely idle. That's the end of his quote. And so he was expressing this puzzlement to a French friend, and the latter responded that, quote, Arabs in Algiers never do any more work than was absolutely necessary, unquote. And the French friend goes on to explain to Rapard that attempts by the French state to increase the rations had actually reduced the productivity of Muslim Algerians. And so Rappart then wonders if the figure of Homo economicus was based on a Scottish template. Perhaps Homo economicus was actually a quote unquote Nordic mountaineer, and this was a very sociological being, he argued, than the Algerian Arabs. And so he wondered, would Adam Smith have defended the universality of Homo economicus if this individual had been, quote, reared among the sun-baked race of Arabs who prefer leisure to work, security on the lowest scale to insecurity of initiative, and therefore equality to liberty, end quote. And so Rappart himself does not pose this discussion in explicitly racial terms, but I think it's pretty clear that lurking behind this question of the Scottish versus the Arab template of man is also how different races are defined in relationship to labor and productivity. And so, as I mentioned, I think this anecdote gets at the heart of my book, which looks at how the French state embarked on development programs after World War II. And so during this period, economists and politicians revisited older debates on the relationship between race and the economy. And that is to say, they're also discussing this against the backdrop of the Cold War, and increasingly they promote market exchange as an essential weapon that would defend Western civilization and also combat the twin threats of, on the one hand, totalitarianism, and on the other hand, decolonization. So this is the kind of intriguing anecdote that I opened the book with, but perhaps it would be nice to take a step back and talk about the broader story in French Algeria. And so this next slide gets at my dissertation topic. So for those, who are thinking about, the book, how books relate to dissertations, my dissertation was actually pretty narrowly based on this development plan called the Constantine Plan, and you can see some propaganda for it on this slide. The Constantine Plan was a social and economic development plan that the French president Charles de Gaulle introduced in 1958. And so for those who know Algerian history, you'll know that 1958 is right in the middle of the Algerian Revolution. So he's unveiling this development plan at a moment when Algeria is fighting for independence. And he's hoping that the development initiatives will convince the FLN, the Revolutionary Nationalist Party, that, that perhaps this is not the right battle, and help them, help the French, that is, attract Algerians away from the FLN. And so when I started working on this development project, I had a couple of questions here, three main questions. On the one hand, I was interested in how economic development in French Algeria, where the majority of the population are Arab Muslims, differed from the post-war reconstruction efforts happening in Europe. So Europe as well, after World War II, has these massive attempts at development. And I wondered, how do planners account for the social, religious, and geographical difference that comes with planning in North Africa, or do they just import the same imprint from Europe and apply it there? So that was one question. And I was also interested in this question of the racial or religious difference of Algerians. So that is to say, in the field of French Empire, there's been a lot of debate about how to think of Algerian Muslims. Is this just a religious difference, or is this also a racialized subject in the context of French settler colonialism? And if it is a racialized subject, which I argue, on what basis? Because clearly we're not talking about race in terms of skin color or other clearly phenotypical markers, as has often been the case in the Atlantic world. So we're in, the Mediterranean has a different racial formation than the Atlantic world and chattel slavery, where much of the theorization about race and racial capitalism has come out of. And the third question that I was interested in was about what happens after colonialism is over. So in 1962, Algeria wins independence, and I wondered what happens to this massive development initiative when the Algerian state is now in charge. Are there continuities? Are there ruptures? What happens to all the expertise? Do they just, discard all the plans and throw them in the bin? Or does this knowledge have a kind of afterlife in some way? So those were my three main questions. And so as I was looking in the archives, I came across the following quote, which really structured my way of thinking in the book. And the book is structured around these two figures. The figures who are, of course, ideal types, right? Neither of these individuals has ever actually existed. Homo economicus on the one hand, and Homo Islamicus on the other hand. So I'm going to read out loud a kind of extended version of this quote. So this is by one of my main French planners who is writing the Constantine Plan. And he says, thanks to the Constantine Plan, Homo economicus has been born. He has replaced Homo Islamicus, who accepted an extremely low level of material needs and who, as a result, did not feel the need to work more than necessary. And here I'm going to continue a little bit. Homo Islamicus slowly is becoming Homo economicus, who is driven by his needs just as his European counterpart is, and who consequently starts working and is concerned with the betterment of his output and bonuses, or with improving his skills, and who has the underlying and yet profound desire to uplift his children and the next generation. So here you can really see that in terms of the planners, and these are kind of technocratic, these are not military figures, these are not classically trained Orientalists, these are not the people Edward Said is studying. These are economic planners and technocrats, and even in their thinking, they are making this distinction between the wealth maximizing European subject, who is also a man, and this kind of Orientalist residue of Homo Islamicus, who is inherently resistant to modernizing initiatives, and, as I argue in the book, seen as lacking the capacities or aptitudes to navigate a market economy. And one of the main goals of the Constantine Plan is to transform Algeria into a liberal market society that would be more profitable than the kind of autarkic, protected economy that had existed up until this point. So this was a quote that I stumbled upon, and I wanted to talk about this tension between Homo economicus and Homo Islamicus. And again, it's perhaps useful just to really highlight here that when I'm talking about Homo Islamicus, and even the way the colonial state talks about Homo Islamicus, it's their phantasm of an Algerian Muslim and what that is in terms of a colonial legal structure. So they're not actually concerned with if Algerian Muslims consider themselves Muslims, if they, if they pray, if they fast. This is not the feature or the concern of a colonial state. And I'll come back to that with this next slide. And so to grapple with how planners made use of this accumulated knowledge that had been fashioned over colonial rule, the first chapter of the book, which is more or less synthetic, argues for Islam as a racial regime of religion in Algeria. And so here, I'm kind of trying to get back to this question I was asking in the dissertation, the second one here, about this racial religious difference and how to make sense of it. And so one of the main interventions is to account for the porous nature of race and religion as both analytic and historical categories, and to show also how these shifting visions of capitalism over the course of the 19th and first half of the 20th century were entangled with racial projects. And so they assigned different capacities based on innate characteristics. So this first chapter shows, and I don't have the time to get into all of the legal edifice here, but it shows how in colonial Algeria, religion represented a set of origins and imagined bloodlines, and indeed structured access to property, citizenship, and livelihood. So again, it's to show how land patterns, taxation, laws and even questions of indentured labor were structured around this category of the indigenous Muslim. And this is a longer story, but even if one converts away from Islam, so if an Algerian Muslim decides to convert to Christianity, they are still governed as a Muslim subject. So just to show you how far this goes in terms of being a juridical apparatus that's really about native status rather than a kind of theological set of principles. So we're really, Islam as a kind of governing structure here, not how individual Algerians understand their religious practice or the theological details of their life. So I also wanted to talk about, Cedric Robinson's work, which is another point of reference for me in thinking about racial capitalism. And the photo you have here of this gentleman is indeed Karl Marx, who's in Algeria at the end of his life. And so the first chapter of the book opens with Karl Marx's writings about the revolutionary potential of Algerians. And as I argue, Karl Marx gets a number of things wrong about traditional Algerian landholding, and he gets a lot of things wrong about how those land tenure patterns were shaped by Islam. And so when Cedric Robinson critiques Marx in his book, Black Marxism, he critiques Marx on very different grounds. He critiques Marx for having a kind of secular messianism, but he's not interested in Marx's writing on Algeria because that's not his book. But I'm trying to take that observation and account for how we can use Cedric Robinson's work to open up the racial character of capitalism in Algeria by studying the ways in which the colonial regime structured, as I say in the first point, access to property, citizenship, and livelihood based on this Islamic juridical system. So just to move on a little bit in terms of what am I actually studying, there are three kind of moments to the story, and I won't have time to do them all justice, but I think these are the three main historical periods. The first is the interwar period, when planners for the first time, so this is before the revolution, before World War II, and planners are starting to look to Algeria as a modern space of development. So they're starting to ask themselves, well, maybe we could actually make Algeria profitable. We could invest state funds into infrastructure, and it could be something more than just this exotic, nostalgic environment. The second moment that I talk about, well, perhaps I'll just spend a little bit more time on this. Basically, this chapter about the interwar period argues that at the same time as there are all of these literary discourses on the Mediterranean, people like Albert Camus, who marginalize the Arab or Islamic element, they want to celebrate this Mediterranean hybrid, sometimes Latin Mediterranean, and that marginalization that has been well studied and has often been studied by literature scholars, Edward Said talks about Camus as well, that there's a counterpart in terms of economic planning. And so this part of the book studies the commodification and standardization of olive oil, which is seen as a Muslim indigenous product on the one hand, and the commodification of wine or citrus on the other hand, which are crops overwhelmingly grown by European settlers. And I show how this civilizational discourse of economic aptitudes impacts economic policy in very concrete ways. So I'll perhaps move on to the kind of meat of the book, which is the Constantine Plan and the Fifth Republic. So just a bit of historical background here. As the Algerian War of Independence is raging, the Fourth Republic, which had been chronically unstable and weak, falls more or less due to a coup, and Charles de Gaulle comes to power and begins the Fifth Republic. So there's a way in which the Fifth Republic in France is really born out of the crisis of the Algerian Revolution. And so, the end of World War II in France really begins this drive for economic modernization. And many of the planners and the technocrats that Charles de Gaulle hires to work in Algeria are the products of this. And so one of the quotes that I love is that as de Gaulle is, dealing with this massive war of decolonization, he exclaims, an economist will fix this for me, right? I mean, somehow he thinks the economy will be the key to resolving the crisis. And here you see the person that he elects to do this, Paul Delouvrier, who's on the left, as you're looking at the screen, and he is the civilian counterpart to General Schall, who's on the right. And so you can see how, this kind of technocratic expertise becomes very important. So Delouvrier, for example, you might think, okay, well, he might be a colonial administrator. He must know things. He must speak Arabic. He must have a kind of deep knowledge of North African culture. Absolutely not. The people who de Gaulle hires are actually technocrats who have worked with the European economic community as it's coming into being. So they're people who know a lot about European integration, and they know a lot about how markets can help people come together after a war, because that's exactly the project that happens in Europe after World War II. But they know very little about Algeria or about North Africa. At the same time, they draw on notions of psychology and culture, because at this moment, in terms of post-World War II knowledge, the older Orientalist paradigm that you might know about, perhaps you've read Edward Said or others about the backward, lazy native, has been transformed through the social sciences. There's a new arsenal, I argue, to make sense of the particularities of colonized populations, and that comes about through disciplines like psychology and sociology. But I'll leave that perhaps on the side. If that interests people, I'm happy to take it up in the question and answer sessions. So these tools help shape, again, land reform and economic modernization, especially in the domain of agriculture, which is something I'm very interested in. And so what really fascinates me are how planners keep warning that because Algerian Muslims are, quote, not economists, it would be preferable that the propaganda is in terms of images and not in terms of the actual economic effects of these policies. And so, time and time again, planners are overlooking the structural obstacles to economic development. And here I could talk about the organization of credit, or the way technical assistance is given. And they, instead of dealing with the real inequalities of settler colonialism, they identify Islam as the main obstacle to market production. And so here on the right, you see a farmer's almanac that is trying to use something that sounds like a Quranic injunction to help incite Algerians for market production, right? So it features, it gets the Arabic wrong. As I said, these are not excellent Orientalists, but من رضيه بالقليل من الرزق رضيه الله عنه بالقليل من العمل. So he who is satisfied by meager wealth, God will grant him a meager amount of work. And as I said, these often have grammatical mistakes and typos, but again, they're using religious sentiment to try to instill a commitment to market production. So here to start wrapping up, the Constantine Plan, is not able to construct many of the housing units and is not able to fulfill many of the programs that it wants to because of the war of independence. But I think this notion that Islam has to be accounted for in some way in designing economic development initiatives goes on to influence the international development scene after 1962. So many of these experts go on to work in Africa, to work in Asia, and they bring these kind of culturalist presuppositions with them. Here, I've skipped over how the FLN, the Algerian Nationalist Party, responds to the Constantine Plan, but I will, again, I'm happy to come back to that in the Q&A. In 1962, Algeria wins independence, and Ahmed Ben Bella, the first Algerian president, comes to power, and he makes a dramatic rupture in some ways with colonial policies. He says that his policy will be a specifically Algerian socialism that's rooted in Islam. So for him, there is something inherent about Islam that will help a socialist policy. So we've gone from a colonial system that says Islam is inherently an obstacle to liberal economic policies to Ben Bella, who says Islam is inherently a motor for socialism. And this, of course, had been the subject of lots of debates in the Middle East and North Africa about the compatibility between socialism and Islam, which I'm happy to talk more about later as well. So as I've tried to show here, you have this construction of a racial capitalist system based on Islam as the element that determines racial difference through juridical and economic modalities. And this goes on to influence how the Algerian nation state sees itself and sees its identity after independence. And so, it's not very surprising that Ben Bella, who is part of this radical zeitgeist of the times, opts for a socialist policy, right? It's rooted in a long history of colonial dependence and a desire to have an economic policy that would free Algeria from dependence on the West. Interestingly, this proves really difficult. So, Ben Bella, even though he would love to tell France, look, we don't need your markets, we don't need to keep exporting Algerian wines to France, he actually does need France in a certain way, precisely because the economy otherwise is so weak, and finding other economic outlets is really challenging. So, that's worth bearing in mind as well. But I do think this story that shows how there is a racial regime of religion that's constructed by French colonial policy helps us understand two things on this slide. On the one hand, why in Algeria, Islam, rather than Arabness or Al-Aruba, became the cornerstone of Algerian nationalism. So one of the things I do in the book, which I don't think has been done in studying Algeria before, is look carefully at how the Arabic writings on Algeria from the Mashriq, especially from Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, understand what's happening in Algeria. And as you might imagine, especially in terms of the Ba'ath Party, they are looking at Algeria as a kind of cornerstone of pan-Arabism. And while Ben Bella does make kind of some overtures to pan-Arabism, and here he's with Nasser, of course, in Algeria itself, Islam becomes the unifying element for the different kinds of people living there, precisely because you have a Berber population who sees themselves as Muslims, but they don't necessarily see themselves as Arab. And so Islam is a better cement to kind of bring everybody together. And also because of the way the colonial regime had established a racial formation based on Islam. So that is one way in which I think the colonial story helps us understand post-independence Algeria. The second point that I think it helps us understand is to show, sometimes we think about the economy in terms of, something that just divides up wealth or organizes the forces of accumulation. But I take a kind of Foucaultian approach in the book in that I think the economy is a really privileged domain for thinking about fashioning human subjects and subjectivities. And in this case, fashioning the revolutionary subjects that were the basis for the Algerian nationalist project after 1962. And so just a bit of background here that might be useful. The June 1962 Tripoli program, which is one of the earliest blueprints for the young Algerian nation state, the Tripoli program claims that Islam functioned as, quote, more than a religion, and goes on to specify that it would be the main source for Algerian culture and personality. And I similarly could cite the 1963 citizenship law that invokes Islam as a hereditary principle. And so, for example, according to the citizenship law, it was necessary for the father of an individual to have been born in Algeria, but also for that person to have fallen under Islamic law, personal status laws during colonization. So in many ways, it reproduces the ways in which personal status law and Islamic personal status law becomes the modality for belonging and citizenship. And so some of the things I try to do in the book are also to read the Arabic journal Al-Marifa, which was published by the Ministry of the Hubus in Algeria. And this is some of the intellectual fodder for Ben Bella's program. So one article, for example, argues that while the committees of self-management, the cornerstone of the socialist program, is a notion of autogestion or self-management. And so the article says, okay, well, these committees of self-management clearly seem to come from Yugoslavia. There's a lot of parallels there. Ben Bella and Tito are close, etc. But in fact, if we look back in history further, we can see them as the embodiment of the Islamic concept of hisba, which of course harkens back to the Abbasid times when the muhtasib personally would control markets and exercise these kind of moral, religious, and economic functions. And so here, the people writing for Al-Marifa, who tend to be members of a kind of ulama light, if you can call it that, they are also thinking about what's happening in Syria. Mustafa al-Sabai's work, who is the president of the Syrian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, published Ishtirakiyat al-Islam, Socialism of Islam, in 1959. And so I try to show how Islam, after independence, provides a new model for Algerian revolutionary subjecthood, morality, and solidarity. And just to give you one quote on this, the Minister of Agriculture and Agrarian Reform explicitly constructs economic activity in religious terms. So Marwaz again writes, and here I'm quoting him, it's a bit of a long quote. He writes, Al-Baraka fil haraka, there is benediction in movement. The Algerian masses, which were previously prisoners of fatalism and superstition, are not only developing a collective will and a force of energy, but an authority that will replace the destructible colonial power. Islam is not thus a backwards hereditary defect. It is not an ideological obstacle, but a motor nerve that is necessary for the revolution. And so here you can see how Algerian socialism is using the vocabulary of Islam. And I also try to show its, in some ways, awkward placings between the discourses of pan-Arabism and pan-Africanism that were circulating at the time. And so while people have written about, Algeria's place, the Mecca of revolutions, and how it fits with pan-Arabism and pan-Africanism, they've often seen this in terms of geopolitical divisions only. And so certainly these tensions, these political tensions, especially between Nasser and Ben Bella, play a role. But I think it's crucial to recognize how these divergent histories of racial formations in North Africa and in the Middle East also make it really difficult to just assimilate Algeria to a history of Arab nationalism. And as I mentioned earlier, and here you have a pamphlet from the National Committee for the Algerian Victory, which is a committee in Lebanon. It's a student group, kind of a wing of the Ba'ath Party. And when they organized an annual week of support for Algeria in 1961, they see the Battle of Algiers as a symbol of heroism of the Arab people. Similarly, they start to argue that support for Algeria and why they support Algeria is because they hope for the complete harmony, and the word here they use in Arabic is al-intijam al-tam, between the Mashriq and the Maghreb, right? So they see it as two complementary parts of the Arab nation. And given that Algeria is on the brink of civil war, even in 1963, due to what scholars have called the Berber question, or what's going to happen with the Amazigh populations, this is not exactly, I would argue, how Algerian nationalists themselves are understanding their project. So I also read this Lebanese leftist journal, Al-Adab, and controversies in that journal among, on the one hand, Palestinian intellectuals, Egyptian intellectuals, and how they construct Algeria differently. And so I'll start to wrap up here because I want to leave time for questions. But I would say that, Ben Bella's vision is undoubtedly a radical break with the politics and economics of colonial development. but it still perpetuates the notion that economic planning should express a set of essential civilizational attributes that that are rooted in Islam. So I'll stop there, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Muriam, for this very clear and exciting presentation. Any questions from the floor?